Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle, and I am a feminist. Thank you. I know that the F word is a little controversial for some. I know that it makes some people feel uncomfortable. For me, though, feminism is really about the equality of men and women. And I've worked in a field that has been led really by feminist leaders, and it has brought me to this place where I really care deeply about men and boys. Some people would have you believe that the term feminism is about tearing men down, that it's about promoting an idea of women being superior to men, but I've had quite the opposite experience. For 15 years, I've actually been an advocate for victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, human trafficking, all of the stuff that they listed. I really was taught that the underlying cause of these issues was related directly to the oppression of women. Because the research is overwhelming in that the vast majority of people who are victimized in those crimes are in fact women. And the research is also really clear that the vast majority of those who perpetrate those crimes are men. But I want to be very, very clear about something. The vast majority of men are not perpetrating these crimes. In fact, it's just a small percentage of men who are doing a great deal of harm. So after years of working with victims, I had the opportunity to start working with men who were perpetrators in these groups. And I started wondering, so if we know that the vast majority of men don't perpetrate these crimes, what is going on with the men who do perpetrate these crimes? And so I had mentioned to you that I had been taught that the underlying cause was about oppression, but as I sat in these groups, I started noticing that these patterns, and I thought, this is much more complex than what I had been taught. Certainly the oppression of women was a part of it, but there was much more to the story. And so this was a big shift for me, right? Because I had spent all this time working for victims, and now I was being asked to understand the perpetrator. So as I listened to the stories of these men in groups, I started to hear some patterns emerge. And certainly some of them walked into the room and they felt very superior to women. They treated me as such. They talked about how they had the right to be that way because they were more superior than their partners were. But I was surprised that many of them actually did not talk about this. They had not been taught those beliefs. And so I was trying to figure out, what is going on with these folks? Well, some of the things they started describing were many of them, in fact, the majority of them, experienced in their childhood an intense moment of cruelty or trauma, like many of us do, right? But the added layer of complexity for these men in the groups is that they were talking about when they experienced this trauma or this incident of cruelty, they were being told that they couldn't express their emotions about the event that occurred. So they were being given these messages as far back as they could remember, that as boys or men, they shouldn't have or express certain emotions. And so I think in particular about one guy sticks out for me, and he talked about a time when he was 5 years old, and he could remember interrupting an incident where his father was being abusive to his mother. So he walks in, and he's seeing his mom being hit and kicked and punched, and he starts to cry, right? Because that's an emotionally intense experience. And so he begins to cry, and his dad turns to him and he yells, "Stop crying. This is what's wrong with you. Your mom has made you weak." Right? Think about that, right? Think about how hurtful that must have been to him as a 5-year-old. Painful because, of course, the experience of his dad telling him that is one thing. But also, it created this belief in him that in order to protect his mother from future incidents of violence, he had to lock his emotions up deep inside. He couldn't show anybody these emotions, right? And then he learned in that moment that the only acceptable emotion that he could show as a boy in his household was anger. And so for him, and when you have an emotionally intense experience and you aren't able to express your emotions in a healthy way, that creates a very tangible bind for human beings. And so for him, having this anger bottle up, the anger became rage. Rage is what he took into his first significant relationship. So he grows up, he gets married, and he and his wife he talked about a time when they were at a barbecue, and she makes a very innocent statement to their group of friends. In fact, she thought she was giving him a compliment, and she makes some sort of a statement like, yeah, he's really tough on the outside, but he's just a soft teddy bear on the inside, right? So she feels like she's being loving towards her husband. Well, to him, he hears this message, and what he heard her say was, you are weak. So you can understand how he would have a reaction to that idea, right? After what occurred in his childhood. So when they get home, unfortunately, he acts out of his rage and he becomes abusive to her. And this time, he's the one causing the cruelty and the pain. A mentor of mine from the Family Peace Initiative program calls this the River of Cruelty. So when you experience a trauma, you get placed in the river by someone else, right? It's not your fault that you experienced the cruelty, but you were placed in the river by that person. And if you aren't thrown a life preserver by someone, then you can get stuck in the river of cruelty. And for him, no one came along to say to him, it's okay for you to express your emotions. In fact, it's important for you to express your emotions. And so then he just passed the cruelty on down the river. And so that's one part of it. Now, I don't talk about his childhood trauma as a way to excuse or justify the violence that he perpetrated in his adulthood. My belief is that he was not responsible for the cruelty that was done to him, but he is responsible for the cruelty that he passed on to others, right? So he has to still be accountable for that. But I think that if we're going to really understand how we prevent these incidents of violence, we have to also understand that childhood trauma part. And that's the part that I think that's been missing. The other part of this, of course, is our socialization, the way that we raise boys. Another pattern that emerged for me for those groups is that there seem to be these man rules that are written. And they would talk, I was able to identify some of them. I am certain I do not know all of them. But I was able to identify some of those man rules. And I think at least this was what they sounded like to me. Rule number 1, always be strong at all costs, right? And I think, my goodness, what pressure we put on boys to always be strong and always be tough, and how intense that pressure can be sometimes. And I think rule number 2 is something like, don't show fear or sadness, because these emotions equal weakness. And in particular, I think what they have been taught is that these emotions are not only weak, but they're feminine. And the worst thing that they could be called is feminine in their eyes. One of my favorite movies, so I have my disclaimer, it's one of my favorite movies, is The Sandlot. Are you with me on this one, right? It's a very quotable movie. For those of you who have not seen it, it is a coming-of-age story about a group of boys, and the only thing that matters more to them than their friendship is the game of baseball. And so their local sandlot is their prized possession. Well, in the scene that I'm going to talk to you about, they come riding up to their sandlot, and here come their arch rivals on their bicycles, right? And so they have to be territorial. They have to guard their sandlot. And so they engage in what I'm going to call a verbal battle of the wits with each other. And it starts out something like this. Our protagonist says, "Watch it, jerk." And then the arch rival says, "Shut up, moron." And then they say, "Fart smeller," "scab eater." it gets really bad. I'm going to stop right there because it actually gets a lot worse than that. Just see the movie. Google it on YouTube. But at the very end of this exchange, our protagonist says, he completely ends the exchange of words by saying, "You play ball like a girl." And it completely stops the argument. Completely. All the boys go, because there is not an insult worse for them than "you play ball like a girl." And so I think, again, I love this movie. I know there is a place in our culture for humor, but I do have to worry about the unintended consequences of us, sharing messages with boys that the worst thing you can be is like a girl, because then how do we expect them to grow up and respect or see girls and women as their equal if this is so normalized in our culture that it's a running joke in our popular culture? Okay, so rule number 1 was always be strong. Rule number 2, show no fear, show no weakness. I think that rule number 3 is, you hear different versions of it, but I've heard things like boys will be boys, or it's just natural for them to be this way. More recently, it has sounded like it's just locker room talk. I'm going to try not to say more about that. And I think not only is this negative to women, right? Not only does this put more pressure on women to somehow be more moral than men or something like that, but I think what a disservice to boys and men, right? I don't know about you guys, but the men and the boys in my life are a lot smarter than that. And they are really wonderful people who absolutely can control themselves. And so I think, not only is this harmful to girls and to women, this message, but it is completely a disservice to men and boys as well. So, I worry that the impact of that is that we have an expectation that somehow boys and men have to be these emotionless robots. And is that what we really want? Not at all, right? A friend of ours recently had a Facebook post, and you know how wacky those can get real fast. And she had said something, and there was a man in the Facebook feed who responded back to her response, and he says something like, "Well, clearly I am more credible in this argument because I am divorced from my emotions." And so he's arguing with her, right, that because she's being emotional, she doesn't have any credibility in what they are talking about. Well, I'm going to give you a quick, oversimplified science lesson. It is really difficult to divorce from your emotions unless you're a sociopath, which he might have been, I don't know. Right, our emotions are a part of our healthy brain functioning. If a saber-toothed tiger comes running on the stage right now, I really hope my emotions kick in and that I either fight, flight, or freeze, and I'm really hoping it's not freeze, right? And so we need our emotions. Everyone needs their emotions, right? We need to feel love so that we can make connections with other people and create families and create communities. And so it's an important part of healthy functioning to have emotions. And so I'm not quite sure why we would want 50% of our world's population not experiencing or not acknowledging those emotions. So, I guess what I'm asking you to do is to join me in challenging these rules. I'm asking you to not have expectations that boys should be raised in a way where they're bigger, they're badder, and they're tougher than the next one. Because where does that stop? Right? Where does that end? And where does that lead us? So I would just say to the boys and the men in the audience, you will experience fear, and that's a part of your humanity. And you will experience sadness, and that gives you the opportunity to reach out and connect with other human beings. And so I'm hoping that And someday in the near future, those man rules, we look back in time and we go, what were we thinking? Boys don't cry. Of course boys cry, right? And that also, we look back and that play like a girl is just a badge of honor. Thank you very much.